everyone in the room ready? Let's start. We affirm resolve the United States federal government ought to pay reparations to African Americans, and our first and only contention is collective action. Paying reparations would empower and improve modern civil rights advocacy in 4 ways, and the first is freeing up political resources. The way things stand in the status quo, as Thomas McCarthy from the Center of World Dialogue explains, reparations efforts are a political dead end. He writes, though resources have been expended on the reparations battle, support for other racially progressive policies, like affirmative action, has been allowed to erode. Paying reparations would allow civil rights advocacy to refocus itself on its broader goals and expend its political resources on other areas. This has been proven empirically by Eric Yamamoto of the Boston Law Review. He writes that following the Japanese Americans reparations process, the reparations network and coordinated protests that resulted in the reopening and publicizing of the military investigation of racial harassment and helped expose the racial underpinnings of anti-Asian violence. Second is motivating the progressive agenda. Progressivism to the passage of reparations is a sign that the government is more receptive to civil rights reform. This is critical, as David Meyer of the University of California finds, when aggrieved groups perceive that change is possible in a particular policy area, they are more likely to mobilize activism. The Leadership Conference finds, for example, that even though it focused primarily on African Americans, the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s also inspired movements of Latinos, Native Americans, Asian Americans, women, and more recently, people with disabilities and gay and lesbian people. Third is increasing legitimacy. Paying reparations would be a public recognition of the claims that organized civil rights advocates have been making for years about structural discrimination, thereby enhancing their legitimacy. This higher credibility means that more people get involved. Henry Walker of the University of Arizona explains that legitimizing elements of social movements can counteract collective action problems and increase the likelihood that self-interested individuals take collective rather than individual action. Fourth is increasing efficacy. Martha Biondi writes that the primary action in the United States has been led by a grassroots reparations movement developing the urge for action. Alfredo Robinson of GW furthers that African American reparations has emerged as one of the most predominant civil rights issues of the new millennium. Thus, whether or not reparations are paid will affect the perception of efficacy of the modern organized civil rights movement. Paying reparations would increase the perception of efficacy of organized civil rights advocacy, which is critical in building the movement. This is because victims of serious discrimination are often unlikely to join social movements because they can't afford to waste their time. Increasing perceptions of efficacy through a major policy victory, like the passage of reparations, helps convince the marginalized that it's worth it. Leon Putty in the Oxford Handbook of Political Psychology confirms that feelings of efficacy in collective action especially engages those who are faced with closed political opportunities. Thus, Russell Spears of Cardiff University finds in a meta-analysis of 182 studies that social movement efficacy is responsible for a proportional increase in collective action by 39%. Gerald Rosenberg of the University of Chicago argues that without political mobilization, the battle to end discrimination is unlikely to make any major strides. The reason why social movements are so critical is simple. Anthony Chen from the University of Michigan explains that social movements shape policy outcomes by signaling to legislators the policy preferences of specific segments of the electorate. Chen from Michigan finds, historically, social movements have been an incredibly effective way of passing anti-discriminatory policy. For example, even after controlling the public opinion, Chen from Michigan finds empirically that when civil rights groups were pushing for fair housing legislation, a 1 standard deviation increase in civil rights mobilization made it 2.6 times more likely that fair housing legislation would pass. This is just a piece of the puzzle. When the civil rights movement gains support, more anti-discriminatory policies are passed. Motivating more reform is critical, as Quebec's Department of Immigration and Community Culture confirms. With no policy or government support, problem situations degenerate and transform into social crises. For these reasons, we affirm.
Contention 1 is destructive discourse. Reparations would warp the current public discourse on race, transforming existing dialogue in the nature of race and its impact on society to a battle of defensiveness. The suddenly racist mainstream media will sensationalize and exaggerate the racist fringe of this opposition, implicitly legitimizing their views. As Kirsten Savali of the Root notes, if institutionalized racism is the poison, then mainstream media is the needle that pushes it deeply into the veins of society. For example, media would publicize and harp on stories of reparation recipients misusing the money, broadcasting misconceptions about recipients. Already, Jacqueline Bacon affair notes that mainstream media media slants coverage against reparations supporters and other racial activists, which is a problem because the University of Amsterdam's Toon Van Dyke says that media is the principal shaper of public perceptions of race. That's why prominent African-American scholar Walter Williams of GMU says, I cannot think of a better fortification for racism than reparations to African-Americans. Contention 2 is a death knell for reform. Passing reparations trades off with substantive reform for 3 reasons. First, by breeding complacency. Cato's Jonathan Blanks writes, reparative payments would signal that the debt America owes to its black citizens will have been paid, yet he further complaints regarding their citizens, being met with contempt and rejected. An example would be reparations for Native Americans, since their passage would see no meaningful progress or attention directed towards them. Second, by racializing the welfare state. Wake Forest professor Hannah Brown explains that the most powerful determinant of one's support for social programs is how closely one associates the programs with race. That is to say, the more a person views a social program as a racial handout, the less likely one is to support it. That's problematic for the reparations movement, which unabashedly rebrands otherwise race-neutral policies as racial payback. This dooms support for public policy programs, as welfare politics becomes steeped in toxic racial politics. Brown finds in an award-winning study, this rebranding constrains the efforts of anti-poverty advocates who lobby for reform and limit the formation of effective broad-based coalitions. Even worse, she finds, these racial conceptions of welfare institutionalize racism in the government, as politicians can build racialized understandings of poverty through past punitive measures that disproportionately harm African Americans. Even worse, these effects are enduring. According to Northwestern professor Martin Guylands, our perceptions of the welfare state are holdovers from the 1960s. So while reparations may have a short-term effect on people's lives, they destroy any chance of durable change. Overall, Noah Millman writes in the New York Times that rather than foster reconciliation, reparations will merely stiffen opposition to other programs designed to address disparities. An underappreciated way reparations interact with the social safety net is through cut-go procedures, which by House rules requires that every dollar increase in direct discretionary spending, like reparations, must be offset by a dollar cut in another direct program, such as welfare, social food stamps, and the like. Spending a major amount of reparations, therefore, would decimate the social safety net. This is problematic because A, it makes people associate racial justice with massive safety net cuts, and B, would increase the number of people in poverty to the point of Bryce covert and fake progress. Direct discretionary spending lifts tens of millions of Americans out of poverty every year. Third, by squandering political capital. Right now, the prospect for reparations passage is functionally zero. So as BU's Glenn Lowry writes, if reparations could even remotely be considered plausible, it would require proponents to invest all of their political capital and make innumerable compromises. The Atlantic Stephen Crumb corroborates this, writing, nothing would blow apart Obama's progressive coalition faster than reparations to African Americans. Making reforms to ameliorate necessary current problems, hyper-incarceration, ghettoization, abusive policing, and racial income disparities, near impossible. As Blank summarizes, simply put, the political movement necessary to make reparative payments will be far better spent on other reforms with greater impact. The NAACP itself put it best, writing, our position is a flat opposition of both philosophical and strategic grounds to an illogical, diversionary, and paltry layout for guilt-ridden whites anxious to avoid the decisions they must make. The debate about reparations takes away from larger, more urgent debates. For all these reasons, we are very proud to engage.
Is everyone ready? I'll get the first word. So when you talk about like media backlash in the first contention, whatever thinks that they're complacent and racism is over-legislating, your second contention, don't those directly contradict each other? Because why would the media ever be racist? Like why would they ever like backlash against Americans if they think it's over?
Wait, that's not true. What we're saying, it's not saying it's over, it's saying our obligation to help is over. So that is a distinction that you're not drawing when you ask that question. Okay. Can I ask you a question? Yep. Your only historical linking that like proof that reparations cause collective action is this download evidence about opening investigations into the military, right?
That's one of them.
Can you give me another one?
I mean, when we mentioned in our political cases, like, influence contention, where we saw like in our second one, is it will motivate the President agenda. And that's the civil rights motivation when we actually increase the actual motivation for other groups.
Right? Can you tell me an example of policy that like grew out of these investigations or grew out of
so you would argue that like the modern like gay rights movement was coming from that.
Okay, what I said is the civil rights movement the same as the reparations movement?
Well, the reparations movement is a small segment of the civil
I would
rights
contend
movement.
that the reparations movement is uniquely toxic and if you can't draw parallels to the Civil Rights Act.
Why not? Because it's a part of the same movement.
No, it's not part of it.
Yes, it is.
No, it's not. Because toxic. Groups like the NAACP oppose it. It causes way more political backup, so you can't have a discourse. But let's stick to my question, okay?
Okay.
What? The example about your example that you gave cases down the road about investigations. One, how is that a collective action?
What do you mean, how is that collective action?
It's the military opened up investigations into abuse.
So like
That's not
okay,
collective.
so what we tell you specifically in case is that the organizations that were trying to advocate for reparations started to move their focus to trying to open up military
So
investigations.
how did that translate to? One, how did that translate into policy? How did people's lives improve?
Okay, it literally overturned and opened up the discussion about anti-Asian
In the bigger picture, how did that help you?
Can I please ask you a question? Alright, let's talk about what you talk about a decrease in political will, right? So like, how do you generate political will?
You generate political will. I was popular mandate.
Popular mandate, what does that mean?
For example, if you're elected, a lot of attention to that would be.
Well, like, how do groups generate political will, right? Like, what do they do? So like, they try to move political resources to creating politicians, right?
Yeah, yes. Sure.
Okay, so like, doesn't that mean that our first warrant counteracts your second intention? Because what we're telling you is that we generate more political resources in the long run.
But here's why. You say political resources are important. We tell you that there's no such thing as infinite political resources. You spend a massive amount of reparations. Just keep in mind, the opposition is so stiff right now, they're going to pass it. It's a massive amount. Okay. That doesn't go back in the day, right? That's what we need for
go back in the future because we know we need that direction. So like, there's a small movement for reparations right now. And what they're doing is they're continually advocating over the course of time.
The only way that's going to get passed is if you burn all the political capital at that.
Like what's happening in the status quo, right, is like, boom, you go really high, but then you divert the political resources that we've been sending for a really long time, and you move it to other programs.
No, once you spend it, you can't just.
But in the long term, when you grow it back quicker than we're actually.
No. Yeah, that's the definition of structure is.
Yeah, you guys are small. So we'll run that. Right. So, are we ready? Let's start with their first contention, which is antagonist destructive discourse. They say that the subtle racist rhetoric of the media is going to somehow be a reason to not give reparations to African Americans. But first and foremost, recognize that the entire issue of media discourse is not unique because their own evidence from Bacon tells you that that's happening in the status quo. And insofar as it's not a change because we pass reparations, we would argue that there's no significant impact to their side. But secondly, and more importantly, recognize that reparations signal the end of the discussion on whether or not the government is obligated to have some form of redress for centuries of institutionalized racism. Meaning that even if you see a short-term spike in discourse that creates the implicit bias that they talk about, in the long term, you still see the decline in the discourse because the reparations policy passes. But third, recognize that the government has to confront the narrative that the media puts forward by providing a counter-narrative, because their obligation is to provide the apology and to stick to the statement that they make. That's what a reparation is. And insofar as they're providing that counter-narrative, that's the difference between a world where you affirm and a world where you negate. You have competing narratives, I would argue, significantly less racist than the one. But fourth, on weighing, they don't give you any reason why the government's obligation ends the moment the media dislikes a policy that they make. I would argue that it's significantly more important for the government to consider centuries of institutionalized racism when making their decisions about policy to the benefit of African Americans. Lastly, on weighing, recognize structural racism is still significantly more important than the implicit bias that they talk about at the end of the contention for the main reason that structural bias acts as a bulwark against policies that would be explicitly racist. And for these reasons, you're not going to evaluate the argument. But on the second contention, they talk about killing reform. First and foremost, recognize that later on in the contention, where they go for complacency and then they talk about backlash. But complacency and backlash are two arguments that intrinsically don't work. But secondly, they do this Hannah Brown analysis and they say that there are going to be punitive policies against African Americans on the basis that it's a racially divisive issue. But they're simply ignoring the warrants in our case when we tell you that even if you're seeing some white policymakers creating backlash, the social policy movements created by reparations and other civil rights agenda policies are going to outweigh in the long term because they're acting collectively to stop discriminatory policies. That's one, the Rosenberg analysis, and two, the Chen analysis that says you see 3 times more anti-discriminatory policy passed. So even if you grant them their link, in the long term it still gets outweighed by the mass of policy created to stop discrimination. But there's a couple of places you can turn your argument. First, look to Andrews of Harvard. He tells you that when you see policy backlash and threats to the social movements that we talk about in the case, those groups get increased support from people because it's seen as a threat to them. But secondly, Miller, he compounds on the watchdog effect, where he finds empirically that when you have threats to those policies that stop discrimination, you see an increase in the funding of groups advocating for social justice. Then they go and talk about discrimination and welfare, and they give you Cutco. Well, look to Scherer in 2014. He tells you that this is only applicable to funds that are distributed annually, which is not what a reparation could be. It could be simply a lump sum payment, meaning it's very easy to simply mitigate their argument. But secondly, recognize that this isn't, like the Cutco argument is entirely a Republican bargaining chip. This isn't something that's been institutionalized by the government that's going to last 50 years. And because the resolution has no time frame, Cutco isn't a barrier to passing reparations. But for these reasons, you're not going to see any impacts off of this intention. But let's look at what they talk about at the bottom, right? They tell you that you're squandering political capital, but they don't define in any way, shape, or form what the political capital that's being squandered is. They're talking about congressional capital, which I would argue is significantly less important than the social movement capital, which creates the resources necessary for the government to listen to the voices of individuals. And for all of these reasons, I strongly urge you to apply.
Yeah. What's harder PDF?
Sorry. PDF highlighted, we appreciate it, but that's the Thank you. No problem. Although they do not provide a framework, it's a pretty clear one that I think will go through being on. Because this idea that we should be looking for actually measurably improves people's lives. That is a standard that you should use to evaluate the strength. Now we want to look first in only potential about collective action. Before I get into specifics, there's a lot of problems with this. First, we've had reparations movement in the past, as my opponents acknowledged. If they give you only one actual example of collective action, which they claim is stemmed as a result, which is Sakamoto analysis saying that we opened up investigations by the military into past injustices in the military against Asian Americans. Yet, as my brother alluded to in Crossfire, that's the definition of not a collective action. That's an individual action. The fact that they give you 0 examples of actual collective action should send up a ton of red flags to you that this, while this might be true in theory, it's not true in reality. But second, keep in mind that collective action is actually going to be reduced when you have these reparation policies. The reason is that when you look at the major collective action organizing bodies, such as the NAACP, they've all said that they actually oppose reparations on the ground that it distracts and detracts from reforms that actually improve people's lives. By actually going counter to what actual organizing bodies want, that's going to be decreasing collective action. Now to the first one, which talks about how it's going to be freeing up political space. First, they give you this analysis saying that it's a political dead end, so we're going to have to refocus the progressive movement. There's a couple problems with this. First, is that they give you no indication of A, why we need to refocus this movement at all, like what's the problem right now, and second, that we are necessarily going to be refocusing the better issues that actually improve people's lives. I would contend that the opposite is actually true. There's a point where we're actually focusing away from issues that currently improve people's lives. Right now, if you look at Congress, there's bipartisan support for things like ending mass incarceration and ending mandatory minimums. So, by focusing away from things like that are actually improving people's lives, symbolic actions, that's actually going to be a net harm. And then they do the second thing that they talk about, which is this progressive agenda. But first they say it's more likely to mobilize. But even if you buy this, more likely to mobilize, you're less likely likely to actually get things done. For instance, take the Affordable Care Act. That may have mobilized a lot of progressives, but that actually decreased their ability to get things done. Look at the debate in Congress about healthcare. Literally all of it is about repealing the Affordable Care Act. It's not actually trying to advance any new measure at all. As a result, even if you have more people mobilized, you're not actually getting effectiveness done, you're not actually measurably improving people's lives. Second, it's actually going to be destroying the progressive agenda overall. And this is the warrant that we give you in the second warrant in our second contention, which is that one of the reasons why America has lower support for social safety net policies in Europe is because we perceive it slightly that social policies are associated with racial policies or some racial handout. The problem is, while that might be a misperception, what they are doing, which is literally labeling a social policy as racial policy, is going to inherently be decreasing the support and drive the evisceration of social safety net. So the progressive movement is actually going to get smaller as a result. But clearly the big problem is there's going to be no reason why this has to be reparations in general. Their warrant is just that passing a progressive policy spawns more progressive policies. Why can't we just pass other progressive policies like ending mass incarceration that's not a unique benefit to reparations? Then on to the next point, which talks about legitimacy. First, again, they're giving you no example, and to the point where we're also delegitimizing this movement by not respecting actual institutions that are most likely to the processes, like the NAACP. Thus, you're delegitimizing their actions at all. And third, keep in mind, you're not actually adding legitimacy just because the government takes some policy. For instance, if President Obama was to enact reparations, it's not like Fox News would go up there and say, oh, that's a legitimate position because Obama said it. They're actually probably going to be saying the exact opposite. So if anything, the legitimacy goes down with their policies. Now on to this idea of efficacy. This is the same couple problems as before, but a couple unique ones. One, then you're decreasing efficacy because you're less likely to get stuff done. When you lose political capital and create complacency, that makes us less likely to get stuff done. That decreases efficacy. But then they give you this trend analysis saying that this mobilization is going to lead to more reform. A, keep in mind, they're not telling you how much efficacy is going to improve, so they can't actually quantify this impact. And second, this analysis is entirely correlatory and linked specifically to fair housing and not actually generalizable. That's a reason why you should be engaging. Thank you. You're failing to give us any example of actual collective action. General is good in the abstract, but when specifics can actually be accessed, the lack of specifics is a problem.
So historically, policies that have for the furtherance of civil rights reform, have those led towards more social movements in the future?
I would say the record on that is yes. Well, take for instance Nixon's Southern strategy, right? I don't know, he capitalized off of these feelings against, for instance, busing and other they perceived as overreaches, and that's led to a permanent shift in our political system. So I don't think the idea that it's necessarily always going to be trending, passing civil rights measures is always going to trend to more civil rights measures. We've seen this permanent shift in other directions.
Would you say that we're better off with respect to racism than we were before the Southern strategy?
Well, before that, sorry.
I think it's pretty clear, right? Like since then, with all the progressive shifts, we're still better off.
I think though that the civil, but however, those aren't directly stemming from it. I think the Southern strategy is probably pretty bad for our nation. But here's the most important point you're not addressing. When specifics are available, why aren't you giving us any specifics? Is a military action an example of collective action?
No. That's an inquiry that was spurred by collective action.
Is that an example of collective action?
No. The military inquiry was spurred by collective action.
You said no. Your partner in this case told us the military inquiry was stemmed from reparations.
Yeah, it stemmed from reparations, which were linked in through people advocating on behalf of
where do you prove that there's some massive rallies that said, like, military, open investigations
I think that's misrepresenting what collective action means. It's not like you're going out to a rally and marching and going rah rah, right? Collective action just means that you take a political stance and align yourself with a movement that has a political stance.
What movement was it? Was there like a military invest now or something movement?
I knew that.
So let's ask you about something that you brought up in your letter. You're saying that
So let me just look at this. Who's being complacent?
The complacent is people who follow the reasoning you yourself say, which is that you yourself say, in response to our first intention, second response, you say the reparations are going to, quote, signal the end of the discussion. It's people who believe that who are going to be
yeah. So that's really cool, right? So the people that are engaging in the discussion are the people that otherwise be passing this sort of response, right? Okay, so we'll run some stuff.
Two case statements and rebuttal, why their case is rational, our case moves into our case, and then why you vote for us in our case. Everyone ready? Start off on two responses stated is the second contention. What he says is, according to Andrews, collective action ends up increasing mobilization after because of backlash. When people see backlash, they see, hey look, we need to help the movement gain support instead of fighting against it. In the long term, backlash is actually an affirmative ballot. Second, they say Miller, we tell you Miller, which actually says increases funding as well. That's one of the points that we need. We need more funding for these groups in order to actually make it so they can collectively act in the long term. Okay, now go on to our case. He makes a bunch of responses. First, he says we only provide one example. For the point that we provide empirically, that overall collective action is more beneficial than passing policy, we access our impacts. Go to our first one when we talk about freeing up political resources, right? He said that we should focus more on other movements. That's our point. The point is that political reparations and reparations of the status quo are actually a dead end. And what we need to do is we need to pass them so we end up in the long term passing more policy. We need to free up the political resources in order to generate more political capital in the long term. Even if we burn it all today, what happens is because we have more abilities to pass policy and more abilities to influence the government, that's what ends up creating political capital long term is our first one. He says Yamamoto is not collective action. The evidence literally says that the reparations networks are the ones who pushed for this. So after they passed reparations, they had those movements done and they moved on to other actions. That's what we're telling you in the long term. Okay, they say we're going to burn down the progressive movement, and he's saying like we're less likely to get things done. Recognize, as long as we're generating more political capital in the long term, the resolution doesn't have a time frame, and we should be looking at the long-term impacts over the short term, because things that happen in the future and farther away are going to be able to benefit African Americans for longer periods of time than short-term backlash like it is in their case. And our first one actually proves we're more likely to get things done in the long term. He says in response to Chen that we don't provide an increase in efficacy. Recognize he drops Spears, which empirically shows that we do have an increase in efficacy immediately. But at that point, what he says is entirely correlational, whereby we provide the warranty case for why it's causation, and second, he provides that this is actually what happened, like the increase in mobilization is what caused this. Those are the benefits we're talking about. We pass 3 times more policy. The neg world does nothing to stop discrimination.
Will we take these in brief running back time, please? I just don't remember us using prep time earlier. That was the first time you used it, actually.
Okay, forget me. Just forget me.
We'll start on there. Please see how it's been. Alright? All of the impact cards don't get empirical evidence is why collective action is important. But the weakest thing is their only example of reparations linking into collective action other than one military investigation coming out of one reparation. The fact that's the best example they can muster is evidence that the probability of their advocacy being true is really low. In every other time in past reparations, the Rose would rise, in Native American reparations, this didn't happen. It's indicative that the probability of their advocacy is low and our probability is higher. All of their empirical cards are about the benefits of collective action. At that point, they're delinked from their office, they lose Chen, they lose all those others. The second big problem is uniqueness. If this argument is true of all progressive movements. It's not unique to reparations. But when we're treated off with progressive movements, that's a problem. But third, they miss the turn of political realignment. It says if this reparations are so unpopular, we're likely to see a Southern Strategy 2.0, just a permanent realignment of the government away from progressive goals that make permanent turn on their case. Go on to our case and why we say it's actually going to trade off with meaningful progressive goals. The first thing is complacency. We say if you sign a ballot for the Pro, you condemn civil rights to the same fate that befell Native Americans. We did nothing. They say that this backlash leads to more mobilization. We say that mobilization now falls on deaf ears because they believe that the debt has been paid. They never tell you how this counter-backlash translates to real policy. Then we talk about racialization. It says you tie the notion of the social safety net into race. That means you decimate the public support for progressive social policy. So in the bigger picture, the progressive movement is harmed when you're cutting welfare and you're cutting food stamps because people view that as a racial issue and public support is decimated. They say from Andrews that there is this watchdog effect, that people are going to be increasing funding to progressive groups. But they never tell you how that increasing funding to groups translates into real policy. Because that increasing funding falls on deaf ears if it's tied to racial politics, tied to reparations. Finally, you talk about political capital, where their only response to this is that Lowry is only talking about congressional political capital. That is not true. They're talking about, in the bigger picture, political capital. If you are spending all this effort organizing, trying to pass an incredibly unpopular bill, there is no ability to just go up and try to pass another really unpopular bill. You need to conserve political capital because political capital is finite. It does not grow back in an instant. Because in the bigger picture, progressive causes are harmed. We are very proud to negate.
So how do we want to do brand?
So we should stand on the yellow.
So in terms of creating policy reform in the long term, why do reparations have to be unique?
Reparations are a trade-off with policies and other progressive policies. And those other progressive policies, which are a more collective mobilization, that's a net negative.
So there has to be like a probability, right? That those policies will pass the ultimate.
So we say that we extend the case that there are these movements right now, and they are existing, and they are likely to pass. I would not. Here's why. I watched the Republican debate on Wednesday, right? You saw this bizarre moment when we have like people up there advocating ending mass incarceration.
Yeah, you also saw the mass
all these people are like trying to demonstrate how children were on drugs, right? What we're seeing is now we have bipartisan support for this measure.
I'd say that there's a lot more to it than just like, oh, so they want to stop a small bit of discrimination, right? Because the overall analysis that we're giving you is that by creating some form of collective action, that's going to create the policies in the long term because there's more advocacy.
That's exactly our point. Which is that your warrants are really general, right? You're saying that we should pass on major progressive policy to legitimize the movement and turn improving efficacy. You don't pass any progressive policy, you would have that benefit, right? So when you're saying off of progressive policies, that's not a net positive.
Wait. So is it really So if you pass some form of alternate progressive policy, right?
Yes.
That policy, the ones that you say are so incredibly popular and have bipartisan support, why do those disappear when you have reparations?
Okay, so what you do is you tie the progressive cause is tied to racial causes. That decreases support writ large for the progressive causes. And the island evidence, the ground evidence.
Aren't they already tied to racial causes because they're trying to solve like disparate impact things?
No, like not to the same extent, right? Right now these policies are largely racial neutral. So if people perceive it in racial terms, that's like there's some secondary reason. You're literally labeling like social policy as racial policy. If anything, that makes sense.
It's like welfare is technically racial neutral, right? But people still perceive it as a racial policy. Like in the world, like we're doing the war on drugs.
Perceive that way. But here's the important thing, right? Because it doesn't explicitly say that. In order for people to perceive it that way, they have to go through a lot of proofs to twist their mind that way. However, when you do what you're doing, it's literally labeling a social policy as a racial policy. That's just not implying That's making the link concrete.
That's linked into the implicit bias that you guys talk about. The racialization of other policies has nothing to do with whether or not they're racially disparate. It's whether or not people perceive it as that.
If you call a social policy a racial policy, people are probably going to perceive it as a racial policy, right?
More than the policies that we're passing over these things are racial policy either way. It's not even.
No, because what we say is that the way they appealed in the Republican debate was they did not appeal onto it as a racial issue. They presented it as a neutral issue, as a general issue. So that is more strikingly, you are making the connection for
What about the
people.
perception of people in the world? Right? They still perceive it as racial.
Not near to the extent that if you literally
So like,
all
what's the
said
greater extent?
okay, the fact that it destroys public support for social programs, to the extent that we don't have that right now.
And I have no questions.
Yeah.
They talk a lot about creating links into empirical policy shifts when we pass reparations. Recognize the most empirical link is that something is guaranteed to happen when you affirm, whereas there's a small probability that something happens when you negate. Now recognize at this point that we're the team providing the clearest unique solvency towards some form of institutionalized racism, and here's why. First, when they're talking about having decimating support for public policy, they only give you one thing. That's the Southern strategy, which is compared to the grander civil rights movement that occurred at the same time. Now, the evidence that we read in case says very specifically that the civil rights movement was considered an extremely racial and specifically African-American movement. But that spurred the resources for other groups to advocate for their own social change. That was completely uncontested this entire round, and is a very clear reason why if you pass some sort of governmental apology acknowledging that centuries of institutionalized racism have been to the benefit of white Americans, that's the reason why other groups are going to suddenly take up collective action. On political capital, the only responses he puts on political capital are that the resources are going to be strained on something else. Recognize at the point where the social movements are currently straining for reparations with things like HR 40 and other movements, at that point, they no longer have to advocate for that. They can advocate for policies in the status quo that are going to benefit them, like fighting against the welfare restrictions that they talk about in case. On the reasons why you're voting for us. If you buy their backlash, there's two terms that go under that you're going to buy. First, Andrews. He tells you that backlash is linked to more activism. And at the point where we're going to an activism in the last 20 seconds of the speech, that's a reason to vote for us. Second, Miller. Increased financing. That is a political resource, and that's the analysis that Casper gave you in summary. That's what increases political will, because that's what makes the group seem even more legitimate. First, okay, so on impacts, right? We give you the long-term impact of structural racism being solved by having the capacity to change the structure of the government. And we increase this in two ways. First, Spears, the empirical analysis that says that when you pass some form of policy shift that's to the benefit of groups that are advocating for civil rights, at least to a 39% increase in political mobilization. And then the analysis from Chen, 3 times more policy to stop discrimination. And Rosenberg says why this is important. That creates the bulwark against discrimination in the long term. And because structural racism is the most important impact in this round, I see nothing but a pro ballot.
We used 16 seconds earlier to make for the floor remaining.
Okay, so we'll be connected. is basically how we're creating these trade-offs. We explain that you're creating the trade-offs in 3 ways. One, by following the logic that my opponents use, that we no longer have to focus on issues like this, means we're less likely to actually combat these issues in the long term. Second, by making the link between social policy and racial policy more complete, by literally labeling, as my opponents do, social policy as an example of a racial policy. And third, by wasting political capital. Now they respond to this by saying we only have one example. That's really ironic, given how their only case is centered on one example, which isn't even an example of a collective action. But keep in mind, more importantly, is something that my brother and I both point out, which is that it isn't just isolated to one example like the Southern strategy. We're seeing welfare cuts under Clinton, we're seeing other cuts under Bush. These are a widespread issue. Then they say it's going to be spurring resources for other groups. But as Bill and I both point out, that they actually prove, what even if collective action is good, they don't actually prove the uniqueness that reparations are needed for this collective action. Remember that any progressive policy could improve the legitimacy or prove efficacy under my opponent's logic. That's really important when it gives us a great weighing mechanism for why trade-offs are so bad. When you're trading off with these other progressive policies, that's going to decrease efficacy, decrease legitimacy, and thus, under my opponent's reasoning, decrease collective action. Then they say that we no longer have to advocate for repair anymore, but as both Will and I pointed out in the rebuttal and the summary, we're not advocating very strongly for it right now, so it's not shifting very many resources. Then they say that backlash needs more recruits, more money, but again, as both Will and I point out, that doesn't translate to any meaningful policy reform beyond their Chen analysis, which is entirely limited to one example and entirely correlatory. And this gets back to the biggest issue in the round, which is how does it meaningfully affect people's lives? We're telling you because of these trade-offs and because you're making these policies toxic, we're trading off with policies like ending mass incarceration, ending the war on drugs, etc. That meaningfully improves people's lives. When we see the social safety net destroyed, see progressive agenda destroyed by reparations, ultimately people's lives are made worse by reparations, and under our mutually agreed framework, that's why you should engage. Thank you.